Well, how exciting. I don't know where to start. Let me start by going back in time and first of all acknowledging a great debt to Ichgai, twice-fold today, of course. And 1971 was my first Ichgai in London, as it turns out, at Imperial College, where I was chasing Carl Hewitt all around, trying to convince him that logic was as good as planar. This conference, I find myself chasing lots of people around. But maybe they'll start chasing me after this talk, we'll see. I want to thank Alan very much for his hard to live up to introduction. I could tell many stories about Alan, but he's already got his Research Excellence Award, so it's not worth the trouble. I would, however, like to acknowledge the inspiration of two great academics who have influenced me greatly. That's John McCarthy and John Allen Robinson. So I need to say that before I go any further. I also want to thank my family for their support and for living with the fact that I didn't acknowledge that in my latest book. Okay, here we go. As Alan said, I've just completed a book, and this book summarizes much of my work over the last 40 years or so. And as Alan says, it's really about human thinking and about how developments in computational logic can help humans rather than just make more intelligent machines. This work, which I describe in the book, attempts to reconcile, unify work that's been done in many fields of artificial intelligence, obviously building on logic in the first place, but also, as Alan said, incorporating and reconciling procedural representations. In fact, as you'll see again, I've incorporated, or we, logicians, if you like, computational logicians, have used logic, computational logic, to encode not only axioms of a more fundamental nature, but axioms that correspond to heuristics of the kind you heard about this morning. Production systems, Bayesian networks, connectionism. But all of this fades into insignificance when you look at the potential of these advances in our understanding of human intelligence, and when you acknowledge or recognize that these advances can help ordinary people to think more effectively, to behave more intelligently, to make, in particular, better decisions in their lives, and in particular also to communicate more effectively and more coherently with other people. There are three parts to the talk. The first part is the big part. I will be looking at a version of computational logic, which is called abductive logic programming, very misleadingly, because it's more like a production system or like a BDI agent than it is like Prolog. And there's very little ordinary abduction in it in the ordinary sense. So it's mainly for historical reasons that we refer to it in this way. The concept of abductive logic programming agent builds upon the notion that people think logically, whether they recognize that or not. And in particular, it builds upon the notion that we think in a language of thought, the so-called language of thought hypothesis. And I will spend approximately 5 slides or so just sketching my argument in favor of the language of thought. And finally, I'll show and talk a little about how the language of thought, the logical language of thought, has a connectionist structure which should make some connectionists happy, if not exceedingly mad. So here we have a sketch of the way in which these different aspects of artificial intelligence can and do contribute to the abductive logic programming model, which I'll be describing. They incorporate a form of production rules. They incorporate heuristics, logic programs. They incorporate full first-order logic in the clausal form. And that's why the term abductive logic programming is so misleading. It could just as well have been called first-order logic with logic programs added on. A very important component also is the use of decision theory in order to decide what is the better way of dealing with the problems that arise in the environment and in solving the goals that we encounter in our lives. All of this is related also to input-output associations, connectionist associations, because they are simply shortcuts in many cases that short-circuit the need for this complex decision making and thinking. To top it all off, the logic, the declarative meaning of this is, I shall argue, best understood in terms of minimal model semantics. Here is a concrete example of how an agent embedded in the world could use logic as its language of thought to help it achieve its goals and to deal with problems that it observes in its environment. So, for example, if an agent observes that there is a fire, an agent might have a conscious or subconscious belief that if there is a fire, then there is an emergency. And that can then feed into a higher level goal that if there is an emergency, then I should deal with it myself, get help, or escape. And now we have three options. How do I deal with this fire, which is an emergency? Do I deal with it myself? Do I get help, or do I try to escape? Well, we can have heuristics, we can have beliefs, we can have goal reduction procedures, we can have planned schemata, all of which can be naturally represented in logical form. In this case, the conclusion or the goal of getting help might be achieved by, in the situation that there is an emergency, such as there would be if there were a fire, and in the situation or in a context where I am on a train, by alerting the driver of the train. Or to put it more declaratively, 'cause I don't know if you noticed that was a procedural way of describing it, to put it more declaratively, if there's an emergency and I'm on a train and I alert the driver of the train, then I will get help. If my belief is true in the world in which I am embedded. And suppose I am on a train, and suppose I alert the driver of the train by, for example, pressing the alarm signal button. I might have other ways of alerting the driver, shouting out loud, and of course there are other things I could do to deal with this emergency, to get help. There are other ways of getting help, there are other ways of maybe running away. So we get a search space. First of all, there's a search space. Reasoning backwards from goals, reducing them to sub-goals gives us a space to search. And then we have alternatives and we need to choose. We need to choose between those alternatives. We need to decide what is the best thing to do under the circumstances. And that decision then leads to action. Action leads to changes in the world. Changes in the world lead to new observations. And if our beliefs are true, and if our goals are realistic, then we may just well manage to survive in this possibly hostile world. In many cases, complex thinking and decision-making of the kind I've just described can be compiled into much more efficient lower-level goals, sometimes called heuristics, sometimes called input-output associations. And here's an example. Instead of doing all of that thinking, you could perhaps find that in most cases, if there is a fire and I'm on a train, and I cannot deal with a fire myself because it's not a little fire, it's a big fire, then I just press the alarm signal button. I don't bother to generate all of the alternatives. I don't bother to do a heavy decision theoretic analysis of the possible consequences and their varying utilities. I just go ahead and do it as a shortcut. Because if you take all of these links and you perform resolution in advance, you can generate a resolvent and you get something like this, if you should end up choosing this way of solving your goal. Well, the dual process theory of thinking is all the rage these days in cognitive psychology, and the dual process model of thinking argues that humans combine low-level thinking using heuristics and stimulus response associations with higher-level thinking in terms of the purposes to which their immediate responses apply. And as Kahneman and Frederick have put it, The intuitive subconscious level, the heuristic level, shall we say, quickly proposes intuitive answers to judgment problems as they arise, while the deliberative, conscious, shall we say, logical level monitors the quality of those proposals which it may endorse, correct, or override. This is only one of the ways in which the two kinds of thinking, both of which can be expressed in logical form, can interact to make humans more intelligent and to behave more effectively. Abductive logic programming attempts to combine the functionality of production systems, heuristics, procedural representations, first-order logic, probability theory, connectionism. And it does it in this way. It represents all beliefs in the form of conditionals, which are logical expressions, and it represents goals in the form of conditionals, maintenance goals in particular. So we observe the environment, we use our beliefs to reason forward and derive consequences, to abstract away from the concrete detail of our everyday experience. These abstractions, such as emergencies, in turn trigger maintenance goals which we want to maintain the truth of in the changing environment. These maintenance goals have a declarative semantics of maintaining truth in the world. These maintenance goals, when triggered, when their conditions hold, when their conditions are true in the current state of the world as believed by the agent, they generate achievement goals, and achievement goals are the bread and butter of planning. So given an achievement goal, you then reduce goals to sub-goals, tasks to subtasks, and you generate candidate plans. Now, we can reason forward, and decision theory assumes that we reason forward from the alternative courses of action to decide which of these alternatives has greatest likelihood and of achieving the greatest degree of success. Again, logic is used at this level. And then finally, there comes a point at which logic has to give way to free will, if you want. Given all of these alternative ways of achieving our goals in the context of maintaining a harmonious relationship with the changing world, we have to decide which of these alternatives we shall take. And this can be done either in a primitive, heuristic, animalistic way, through input-output associations as a shortcut, or they can be done through these higher level, more conscious mechanisms of thinking. Let's apply that now once again to this example and throw away the directions on the arcs. Throw away the directions on the arcs, and what do you have? You have a connectionist representation of the mind. All of our beliefs have conditional form, if conditioned, then conclusion, or conclusion if conditions. Our goals similarly have that form. The big difference, however, if you like, is that goals can be expressed in full first-order logic. So the conclusion here with a disjunction, which gives rise to a search space of alternatives, takes us far outside the realm of logic programming and takes us into the world of first-order logic expressed in causal form. So here we have connections between conclusions and conditions. And these connections, as you'll see later, can be activated in any way we choose. There's no reason to activate them as I've described. First forward from observations, and then finally outward towards actions. We can compile shortcuts, derive heuristics, and we can, as you'll see later, employ any number of alternative ways of activating the relationships between our beliefs and our goals. So for the record, the syntax of beliefs in abductive logic programming is extremely simple. You all know it probably by now. Atomic conclusions and conjunctions of conditions, most of which are probably atomic, others of which may be negative. All variables are universally quantified, so we typically do not write universal quantifiers. Goals in ALP agents, maintenance goals are like production rules in production systems, like plans in BDI agent systems. They generalize first-order logic clauses. They too are universally quantified. They look like logic programs, except they have disjunctive conclusions. It suffices to restrict these clauses to universally quantified, but as it turns out, when the conditions hold, because of the state of the environment, it's convenient to have existential quantifiers in the conclusion. You want to find a state of the world in which you achieve your one of your alternative conclusions. Now this is, I think, philosophically interesting, which is the minimal model semantics associated with abductive logic programming. The beliefs are logic programs, and they don't describe the world as it is, but as the world as the agent believes it to be. So these are descriptive in nature. On the other hand, goals, also in logic, but now in first-order logic, clausal form, describe the world as the agent would like it to be. There's no modalities associated with this separation between goals and beliefs. Conceptually, it's like a database and integrity constraints. The integrity constraints constrain the data, which are like beliefs, to those which the database, so that beliefs conform to them. Observations are the only point of contact that the agent has with the world, other than its actions, which may or may not achieve their intended effects. So the agent's task is to generate a set of actions and assumptions about the world so that its goals are true, that its observations are true in this world which it's made up by means of its actions, by means of its assumptions, and by means of its beliefs. So it's a made-up world that the agent lives in. The world is mainly of the agent's own creation. The only point of contact is the observations that the world throws at the agent. So let's look at that same example again and see how the semantics works. We saw how the so-called operational semantics or the proof theory works, more or less. Here's the way the semantics works. We have a goal. Whenever there is an emergency, I should deal with it either alone, by myself, or with help, or just run away. We observe, for example, that there is smoke. Smoke, so what? Suppose I believe that if there is a fire, then there is smoke. So suppose I believe that if there is a fire, then there is an emergency. So this smoke might be a sign of fire. And if it is a sign of fire, then there's an emergency. But I have a goal that says whenever there is an emergency, I should do something. One of three alternatives at the high level here. So what has the agent got to do? The agent has got to make this goal true. The agent has got to make this goal true, and it does so by generating assumptions, in this case an assumption that there is a fire, which explains the observation that there is smoke. So this assumption explains the observation, and it makes the observation true. So the assumption makes the observation true, and this action, pressing the alarm signal button, makes the conclusion of the maintenance goal true. So this abductive logic programming agent model has a very natural proof-theoretic operational semantics that looks like production systems, combines production system functionality with logic programming functionality, has a neat link to decision theory, but has a shortcut to stimulus-response associations, all of which in turn have a connectionist implementation. So as I said before, there's really no need to say it again. The agent's world is really a world of its own creation for the most part. Its beliefs are entirely made up. They're all in the head of the agent. The only point of contact that the agent has with the world are its observations. And these observations must be made true by its assumptions about the world and by the actions it performs. And in addition to those observations being true, it also must fulfill its goals. So the actions of the agent embedded in the world must be such that its goals can be made true by the actions it chooses to perform. Of course, many different solutions exist. There are many delta, many different sets of assumptions about the world, many different actions, many different plans can achieve the same results. So it's not enough simply to say, simply to suffice, simply to get along from day to day. The challenge is to find the best delta you can, do the most you can with your life, subject to your own capabilities, to the computational resources that you have in particular. Now, in classical decision theory, the value of an action or a course of action is measured by the expected utility of its logical consequences, not simply the cause and effect consequences, but the logical consequences. This expected utility, as we know, incorporates notions of probability. Similarly, in the philosophy of science, the value of an explanation of an observation is measured in terms of how likely a state of affairs in the world might be to explain the observation. For example, tear gas is a less likely explanation of smoke than fire. And explanatory power more generally. How many observations does an explanatory hypothesis explain? The more observations explained by a hypothesis, the better. In the same way, the more goals achieved by a plan, the better. The same criteria used in decision theory to help us choose between different courses of action are virtually identical to the criteria used in philosophy of science to identify preferred explanations of observations. So in abductive logic programming, we can combine the two. We can combine both measures of value of a solution and use this not only to help us make decisions, but also to choose as we search, to search out better parts of the search space, more likely to achieve our goals than more likely to achieve them to a higher degree than other parts of the search space. So as I said, and as you all know better than me for the most part, life is uncertain. But what you may not appreciate, except for fewer in the audience perhaps, is that uncertainty fits in with logic. Logic and uncertainty go hand in hand. So in particular, it's quite natural for a state of the world such as being rich to depend upon not only what you do, an action of your own such as buying a lottery ticket, but what the world does. So you will be rich if you buy a lottery ticket and your number is chosen. And you can use this kind of belief, true or false, you can use this belief, better if it's true, you can use this belief in order to guide your behavior. If your goal is to be rich, if that's what makes you happy, then you can buy a lottery ticket. But the expected value of that decision has to be weighted by the probability that your number is chosen. So decision theory incorporates probability theory, and it is absolutely essential in any kind of agent, whether it uses logic or not. So logic alone is nothing without probability, not logic in a decision theoretic context. In an agent, it doesn't survive without some capability for reasoning about uncertainty in terms of probability, frequency, what have you. And similarly, if you believe it'll rain when you do a rain dance and the gods are pleased, then you can go ahead and do a rain dance. And if you're lucky and the gods are pleased, then it will rain. But of course, what's the likelihood that the gods will be pleased? Decision theory, probability theory gives us mechanisms, does it? Subjective probability it's called, I think, because you're not likely to get a frequentist assessment of this particular state of affairs. So I believe that the agent model that I've just sketched can help ordinary people make better decisions. Forget about robots for a moment and think about you and me and how we can make better choices in our lives. What's wrong with classical decision theory? Classical decision theory assumes that all of the alternatives that we need to choose between are given in advance. It forgets about the fact that they are obtained by triggers in the environment that make us try to achieve certain states of affairs using beliefs that reduce goals to sub-goals. Do we have enough beliefs to generate enough alternatives? Are our beliefs true, so that if we perform these actions, our goals will be achieved? Decision theory has nothing to say, and yet it speaks volumes and volumes. There are far more books written about decision theory, virtually all of which ignore these important aspects of human behavior and cognition. In artificial intelligence, we are focused, for the most part, on those things that decision theory leaves out. We're focused on production rules, plans that are triggered by circumstances, conditions in the environment. So we can fill the gap which decision theory has left out. And we can fill the gap not only to build better robots, if that's what we like, but we can fill the gap when we tell and advise people how better to organize their decision-making processes. And in particular, in the field of search and artificial intelligence, we know that we can guide the search using various best first methods, and we can use the same criteria for deciding what actions to perform to help us explore those parts of the search space which look most promising in preference to those which look less promising as far as the utility or the expected utility of our plans. There's an awful lot that can be done to improve classical decision theory. There are decision theorists who are aware of the limitations of decision theory. There are books written in very informal English, totally unformalized, totally imprecise, which can be made extremely precise and extremely usable, far more usable than they would be otherwise. So that's my first argument, that artificial intelligence has something very important which it can give to people and not just to robots alone. That was the big part of my talk, and now there are a few smaller parts. Something about the language of thought. And why the language of thought? Because many of you will disagree with me because my thesis depends upon the view that we think logically, that we reason forwards, that we reason backwards, that we search a space of alternative plans generated by thinking in a logical way. This is a crazy idea for many people. In the philosophy of language, there are three schools of thought. The first school is that the language of thought is a private language-like representation which is independent of any public natural language that we may speak. This is sometimes called mentalese in the guise that Jerry Fodor first presented it. So the idea is that our thoughts have a language-like structure. There's also the Whorfian hypothesis that we may think in a linguistic manner, for certain purposes at least, but the way we think depends upon the languages that we speak. So people who speak English think differently from people who speak Polish or Japanese. So we actually have different ways of thinking about the world according to this particular school of thought. I think artificial intelligence doesn't leave us in a great deal of doubt about this particular school. I mean, the effort involved in artificial intelligence trying to make sense of natural language, I think proves that natural language is a very poor vehicle for a language of thought. On the other hand, there will be many in artificial intelligence who believe that human thinking does not have a language-like structure at all. Well, if I had to vote and had to put my money on one of these three, or at least if I had to take, if I had to vote for 2 out of 3, I would throw this one away and I'd put my money on the first and the third, because if you do logic right, then it may not seem to have a language-like structure at all. If you implement logic efficiently and you establish links between conclusions and conditions, if you pre-process your thoughts so they can be performed and executed efficiently, then the linguistic structure evaporates. It's hard to see, as I'll argue at the end of my talk. So in abductive logic programming agents, causal logic serves as the agent's private language of thought, whether or not that agent is a human or possibly an animal. Animals too can have goals which they use to maintain themselves in a harmonious relationship with the world. They may not speak public languages like human beings, but there's no reason not to model the cognitive structure of other animals in a similar manner. So how do we find out whether or not this crazy idea might possibly be right? The crazy idea is that not only is the language of thought, not only does human thought have a language-like structure, but it has a logical structure. And in fact, that logical structure is a causal logic structure. How can we possibly make any progress to determine whether this may or may not be true? Well, there is a clue in the relevance theory of Sperber and Wilson, linguist and social anthropologist, who maintain that people understand natural language and they understand the world in general by attempting to extract the most information from their observations for the least processing cost. If an observation is ambiguous, if a sentence uttered by another human is ambiguous, and if we have to make a choice, then what we choose is that interpretation which provides the most information for the least effort, the most information. So that gives us a clue. If you want to identify whether there is a language of thought and what that language of thought might look like, then study human communications which are easy to understand. The easier it is for something to understand, then the closer it must be to the way we structure our thoughts, because there's little effort involved in translating those communications into our internal mental representations. It also works the other way. If you want your communications to be easy to understand, then you should express them in a form that is close to the way in which you represent your thoughts. So if we have a good theory of how humans represent their thoughts, we can express our own human communications to other people in a way which makes it easier for them. And if it turns out that we represent our thoughts in logical form, causal form for that matter, then we could use that to make our communications with them closer to causal form, natural language expressed in closer to causal form, and this in turn ought to make it easier for people to understand what we're saying and to relate it to other beliefs and goals of their own. It should be clearer and more coherent. So let's test that hypothesis and see if it takes us anywhere. One way to test that is to look at public communications designed to be as easy as possible to understand. Where would you do that? Well, one place to look would be at communications designed to help people deal with critical situations such as emergencies. And here's an example taken straight from the London Underground, which is expressed in English, arguably in a form which should be easy to understand, because if it's not easy to understand, then it defeats its purpose. You might as well not say anything. So look at these sentences. The first one, press the alarm signal button to alert the driver. Does that look like a sentence of logic? Or does it look like a goal reduction procedure? What is the goal? Alert the driver. What is the sub-goal? Press the alarm signal button. How do we represent goal reduction procedures in logic programming? As conclusion condition rules. The justification for this procedure is that you will alert the driver if you press the alarm signal button. So the very first sentence is a procedural representation of a logical conditional. Those people who love logic programming and say logic programming is a declarative representation and that's what knowledge representation should be all about, would have us rewrite this sentence as a declarative sentence. They would have us say, if you press the alarm signal button, then the driver will be alerted. Probably a lot less effective than this procedural way of putting it. The second sentence obviously has logical form. Conclusion, the driver will stop. Condition, any part of the train is in a station. There are things left out of this, of course. The driver will stop what? Will stop beating you up, creating a problem, creating an emergency? No, of course not. The driver will stop the train. So natural language has features that are not present in the language of thought. In the language of thought, if we understand this sentence, we understand that the driver will stop the train. Now you might say, does that mean we should say the driver will stop the train? Maybe. But it goes for granted. You can take it for granted, and we often leave out important considerations, context in particular, which is necessary to actually understand the meaning. For example, the driver will stop if any part of the train is in a station, provided the driver has been alerted to an emergency. So this second sentence has a hidden extra condition coming from the first sentence. But nonetheless, to understand this sentence, you need to extract its meaning. And that meaning has a linguistic form, it has a logical form, and it has a simplified form of logic, which is what we call clausal form. If not, again, another logical structure, the train will continue to the next station, blah, blah, blah. Last sentence. There is a 50-pound penalty for improper use. No if then, but is there a hidden implication in all of this? What is the meaning of this? If you put this in your head, how do you store this sentence? What is its significance? I won't tell you. Figure it out. I hope you will, well, it's your problem, not mine now. Okay, so what is involved in understanding natural language? Remember, my argument is that our thoughts have a linguistic form. That linguistic form is a logical form. That logical form is a simplified form, which is clausal in nature. Well, we all know that the first problem of understanding natural language is to identify the intended meanings, to get rid of ambiguities, obvious ambiguities at least. He gave her the book. Who? Who gave whom the book? Well, let's say it's John gave Mary the book. So the first problem is to get closer to logic. Logic does not have he and her. It doesn't have these indefinite pronouns. The second thing is to represent that meaning in a canonical form. John gave Mary the book. John gave the book to Mary. Mary received the book. The book was given to Mary by John. You can't store that kind of knowledge in your head. The only way to deal with the world is to represent knowledge in a standard form, in a canonical form, to process it in a canonical form. So, okay, this is a old-fashioned syntax. John gives the book to Mary, say, as event 1000. This is the classical symbolic notation, but you know that's just notation. It's not even syntax. You know, you can invent any other notation you like without changing the syntax. But the point is that to understand natural language, we have to have a canonical form. We have to represent knowledge. And conditional form, clausal form, is a canonical form. It's the conjunctive normal form of first-order logic, where there are no existential quantifiers anymore. And the existential quantifiers go away because they don't provide enough information. It's more expressive to have clausal form without existential quantifiers than to have full unstructured first-order logic. So my argument is that clausal form, like the form we use in abductive logic programming, is much closer to the language of thought than, say, first-order logic. For example, in clausal form, we would say that if X is a bird, then X has feathers. John is a bird. We wouldn't say, as we say in standard first-order logic, these crazy things. Standard first-order logic is gobbledygook. No wonder natural language is so hard to understand. It's because it allows us to say what first-order logic says. We don't want first-order logic. We want a canonical form which simplifies representations so we can manipulate them easily and understand what people are attempting to communicate. So the argument, therefore, as I've said, is that clausal logic is a potential candidate for the language of thought. And the advantage of that is that reasoning in clausal logic is far, far simpler than reasoning in first-order logic. It can be reduced to forward and backward reasoning, as in the abductive logic programming agent model, as in production systems, as in logic programming. And it can be extended to include resolution. So you can compile complicated beliefs into simpler beliefs. You can generate lemmas, if you like. So the second theme of my talk is that artificial intelligence can help people not only to make better, smarter decisions by taking into account where the alternatives come from, but it can also help people to communicate more clearly with other people. It can help them to express their communications in a form of natural language which is closer to the form in which we represent our thoughts. And according to abductive logic programming, that form is a conditional form, if-then rules, if you want, with a logical form. It can also help them to express themselves more simply. Life doesn't have to be as complicated as we make it out. We don't need the complications of first-order logic. We can express ourselves simply in a way which is closer to the canonical form of our thoughts. And finally, we can express ourselves more coherently because we have a notion of coherence which is the connection between one idea and another idea. And that connection is through the conclusions of sentences and the conditions of other sentences. So I can start my sentence with something familiar coming from the previous context. I can end it with something perhaps new, and then use that new idea and pick it up at the beginning of the next sentence in a connectionist logical representation. So that brings me near to the end of my talk. And you've already seen this connection graph. It's a logical implementation of first-order logic, the clausal form of first-order logic. Here, the direction, forward or backward, is not necessarily relevant. If in our minds we represent our thoughts in a connectionist logical manner, then we can pre-process our thoughts. We can store them not only in a canonical way, but we can avoid some of the search that would be needed at runtime by doing that search at compile time. By establishing the links between new information and old information when we receive the new information, no matter how we might use that information in the future. So that's exactly what the connection graph does. The connection graph takes a set of heuristic beliefs, a set of goals, a set of stimulus-response associations expressed in logical form, and it links conclusions with conditions. So that in the future, you don't have to search, you can just activate a link in order to deal with observations from the environment, in order to feed candidate actions into your decision-making module. So as I've said, connection graphs are a theorem-proving method for first-order logic, which pre-compute links between clauses, conditions, and conclusions, together with their matching or unifying substitutions. You don't have to wait until the last minute. You can do as much of the reasoning that you might need to do in the future, independently of how you're going to use that knowledge, whether forwards or backwards, by computing the unifying substitutions in advance. And then, when you need to, you can activate those links by performing resolution as the need arises. Any strategy can be used, forward, backward, or more. Links that you use over and over again can be compiled into shortcuts. Just do the resolution. Just activate that link and store the result of that activation as a shortcut. These shortcuts are like heuristic rules or stimulus-response associations. More than that, such connection graphs can combine not only clausal logic, not only search among alternatives, not only connectionism, but they can incorporate learning in particular. In particular, links between conclusions and conditions can be weighted by associating statistical information about how often those links have been used successfully in the past. The more often you use a link, the more likely the world in the future being similar to the way it was in the past, the more likely you'll find that link useful in the future. Similarly, observations come in different strengths. Our emotions tell us that a loud bang is more significant than a quiet whisper. Our emotions tell us that, well, all sorts of things. But they filter our observations in such a way as to identify some observations are more worth paying attention to than other observations. So not only can we have statistical information on links, we can have strength associated with our observations. We can have strengths associated with our goals to deal with an emergency than it is to eat it when you're hungry. Both are necessary for survival, but if both are activated, if both an observation of hunger and of fire are observed at the same time, our emotions will tell us which is more significant. So we can take a connection graph and we can clamp onto our observations and onto our goals. We can clamp different strengths and we can associate different statistical utilities, frequencies rather, with the links, and then we can propagate them through the graph, just as Patty Mays does with her activation networks. And we can then choose, maybe coming forwards and backwards, whatever links have highest activation obtained. And we can let activations decay if they're not used. We can let activations get strengthened if they're repeatedly observed. And we can take techniques that have been devised in fields of artificial intelligence that have had nothing to do with logic and incorporate them in logic-based frameworks. If in addition, if in particular we perform such a search, we see that we obtain in particular a kind of best first search for a decision with highest expected utility. Now, one of the reasons I believe that people have not associated logic with connectionism is these internal links, links which involve concepts which are not present in the external world. Well, logic never said that the symbols in your head need to correspond to real things in the outside world. So when you have a connection of concepts in your head, the only contact with reality is through observation sentences, as philosophers of science told us a long time ago. Everything else is theoretical concepts. It's in our heads. We use these theoretical ideas about emergencies, which have no correspondence in reality, in order to organize our behavior and organize our thoughts. So one of the great obstacles to taking on this thesis that logic can serve as a language of thought is this mistaken, erroneous assumption that if we have symbols in our head, they must represent something in reality. And that's why I push so hard the semantics at the beginning of my talk. And notice, in fact, that these internal symbols in our private language of thought need have nothing to do with the symbols in any public language of thought. So we can think logically without being able to express ourselves in any natural language whatsoever, without being able to express ourselves logically, without being able to express ourselves at all. So that, I think, is an important consideration as well. So allow me to conclude. For this audience, I think it's important to throw open the challenge and say, let's not compartmentalize our work. Let's not ignore the work of others. Let's not treat other theories as not worthy of consideration. But let's all try to work together. Let's try to benefit from the work of others, even if it has nothing to do with what we've been doing ourselves. Let's have some respect for the theories that people have developed, which deal with their experiences, even though they don't deal with ours. And let's see if we can't bring all of these techniques together, whether in the way I've presented or some other way. But let's not ignore one another. And let's try to work together, if only because ordinary people can benefit from the results of this work. This work provides us with a better psychology, a better linguistics, a better theory of law, a better theory of management science. It's potentially a much better theory of the normative disciplines than anything we have up until now. So let's do it for them. Let's do it for people, even if we want to compete among ourselves. I've sketched two ways in which I think people can benefit from what we've done. And if you want to find more, just look inside. Thank you.
There's a growing body of evidence from experimental psychology that the hypothesis that you reject is in fact the true one, that the language of thought is natural language. What is your response to that evidence?
You're quite right. It's the popular thing. It's quite popular in philosophy these days, and it's quite popular in psychology. People delight in little experiments that seem to suggest that Mayan Indians, for example, have different ways of organizing their view of space. They don't use left and right, they use north and south. Just wrong. Well, not just wrong, it's unhelpful. It doesn't explain the evidence adequately. So it is a hypothesis, but I don't believe that it explains as many of the observations as other hypotheses. Natural language is too incoherent.
Okay, it's front row.
Thanks for the talk. In your earlier part, you mentioned about selecting goals for agents, and later on you mentioned about emotion. I think that I heard that word. So do you think in selecting goals, you mentioned that agents need to pick the higher utility ones. So do you think there is a link between emotion and utility, or you think emotion is utility?
Well, I think emotions have been developed through evolution to help us in a quick and frugal way approximate utility. And of course, if evolution isn't fast enough, emotions that may have proved useful 10,000 years ago may not be so useful today. Which is why it's useful to have higher ways of thinking to monitor our purely instinctive responses to the environment. So emotions they come from typically through evolution, which has generally been good to us. Evolution has been good to us, but it's not the last word, and we are still evolving.
Okay.
So I really appreciate the general push of your talk to say how can we use this sort of logic to help ordinary humans make decisions rather than, say, create robots to replace them. We obviously have a lot of unemployment and probably don't need robots anytime soon. However, one interesting point is when you sort of categorize your different views of language, I think you may have been missing one. And this one kind of may twist your story a little bit. I'm wondering how you would react to this. So there's been a lot of evidence, look at maybe say Andy Clark's Material Symbols article, that seems to point not that human thought is like natural language and that somehow different natural languages result in different kinds of thought. Actually, I think it seems to be that people generally do think fairly simply across cultures, but nonetheless that what may be the language of thought is actually deeply rooted in sort of evolutionary heuristics which don't resemble logic per se, often because they're deeply rooted sensor-motor sort of feedback loops which have to operate extremely quickly in order to get things done and not be eaten by tigers and whatnot. But at the same point, you could say that, well, maybe the language of thought, may not look like logic, but the kinds of problems that we're encountering, that average people are encountering today, do require a form of public language which logic might be. That logic is sort of external symbols which then feed back into people's decision-making processes, and they could help make those decisions. That maybe the kinds of language of thought that we've evolved with may not be sufficient to answer the very complex and often logical problems that we encounter, in our society. So how would you react to that sort of fourth view of language, let's say?
Okay, in this connection graph, Well, once you've established the links, the names of the atomic sentences don't matter anymore. So activating all that matters are the links to the outside world. So the symbols, these symbols that look like English, they could just be, well, that. I mean, they could just be crazy stuff. All they do is they establish links and connections. So is that logic? Yes, it is logic. Is it stimulus response associations that can be triggered very fast? Yes, I think it is.